The autumn Townsend's second harvest turned to black rot in the ground. The town of Caldwell Creek stopped whispering about his misfortune and started calling it something darker, something permanent, something that lived in the marrow of a man like a splinter too deep to pull out. Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the year 1878, was not a gentle place for men who could not produce. The whole town sat on the edge of the great open plains, where the wind came down from the north like a cold judgment, and the soil gave or it withheld according to some calculus that no preacher had ever fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, which meant that what a man grew could reach markets in Wichita and beyond, and what a man failed to grow became a public record of his worth. Lewis had felt that record being written in the eyes of every man who passed him on the main street, every woman who paused her conversation when he walked by the dry goods store, every child who had heard their parents talk at supper. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of real labor, with dark hair that the sun had threaded with early gray at the temples. He had a jaw like something carved for the purpose of enduring, and eyes the color of creek water after a long rain, somewhere between gray and green, and full of a quiet that people sometimes mistook for pride. It was not pride. It was the particular stillness of a man who had learned that speaking about pain did not diminish it. The first harvest, the one in 1876, had failed because of drought. That was no one's fault, and the town had been largely sympathetic. Half the farmers in the county had struggled that season, and Lewis had managed to survive it by selling 2 of his horses and taking on repair work at the livery stable through the winter months. He had gone to bed those cold nights with sore hands and a clear conscience, telling himself that the land would come back, that good soil remembered itself, that spring would be different. The spring of 1877 had been wet and hopeful, and Lewis had planted with everything he had left, borrowing seed credit from Hector Drummond at the general store on the strength of his reputation as a hardworking man. The corn came up beautifully through May and into June, green and tall and swaying in the evening breeze like something almost sacred. He had stood at the edge of his field on a June evening and felt the tight fist in his chest begin to loosen for the first time in months. He had allowed himself just once to feel something close to joy. What came in late July was a blight, a fungal rot that crept through the ears of corn like a slow fire, turning golden silk black, collapsing stalks that had seemed robust and full of promise. By the time Lewis understood what was happening, it was too late to save more than a fraction of the crop, not enough to pay back Hector Drummond, not enough to cover the property tax, barely enough to feed himself through another winter. That was when the talk started in earnest. Old Clyde Barrick, who owned the feed store and had opinions about everything that happened within 30 miles, said at the saloon one evening that Lewis Townsend carried bad luck the way some men carried disease, and that the wise course was to keep a certain distance. Clyde Barrick was the kind of man whose words had weight in a small town simply because he said them loudly and often enough, and within a week, the idea had taken root more successfully than anything Lewis had planted. By the spring of 1878, Lewis was still on his land barely. He had negotiated a payment plan with the county tax office through a clerk named Robert Finley, who was at least decent enough to write it down formally so there could be no misunderstanding. He still owed Hector Drummond the seed credit, which Drummond reminded him of every time their paths crossed with a particular kind of tight smile that was worse than outright hostility. Lewis had taken to riding the longer way around town just to avoid that smile. He was 31 years old and the land was all he had, and the land had failed him twice, and everyone in Caldwell Creek had an opinion about why. Letitia Fletcher arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday in late March of 1878 on the afternoon stage from Dodge City, and she did not look like anyone who had ever stepped off that stage before. She was 26, tall for a woman of that era, with a straight-backed posture that came not from vanity, but from having spent years managing her own affairs without anyone to lean on. Her hair was the deep brown of fresh-turned earth, kept in a practical braid that she wore over one shoulder, and her face had the kind of clear, direct beauty that does not announce itself but simply stands there and waits to be understood. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they moved over the town of Caldwell Creek the way a surveyor's eyes move over unfamiliar terrain, assessing, calculating, not unfriendly but not naive either. She carried a single large trunk, a carpetbag, and a canvas sack that clinked softly when she set it down, the sound of glass jars carefully packed. She had come from Missouri originally, though she had spent the past 3 years in Dodge City managing the household and small kitchen garden of a widow named Mrs. Constance Albright, who had died in February of a sudden fever, leaving Letitia with a modest sum of saved wages, excellent references, and no particular reason to stay in a town that held no claim on her heart. What had brought her to Caldwell Creek, specifically, was a notice she had read in the Dodge City newspaper, placed by a land agent named Silas Prout, advertising the availability of a 40-acre parcel adjacent to a working farm on the eastern edge of the county. The price was more than she could afford outright, but the notice had mentioned possible lease-to-own arrangements, and Letitia Fletcher had learned, from a life that had required considerable resourcefulness, that most prices were in fact negotiations waiting to happen. She had a reason for wanting land, a serious one. She had grown up watching her father work someone else's soil in Missouri, paying rent that consumed everything a good season produced and left nothing for a bad one. When he died, there had been nothing left to leave her. She had promised herself, quietly and with the particular ferocity of a woman who makes promises to herself with no witnesses, that she would own something before she was 30. She had 2 years left, and she was not inclined to waste them. Silas Prout's land office was a narrow building between the barber shop and the telegraph office, and Letitia went there directly from the stage stop, trunk being temporarily minded by the stagecoach driver, a laconic man named Abe who did not seem bothered by the arrangement. Silas Prout was a man in his late 50s with spectacles and ink-stained fingers and the careful manner of someone who had seen enough human desperation to stop being surprised by it. He stood when Letitia entered, which she noticed and appreciated, and he listened to her inquiry about the 40-acre parcel without interrupting, which she appreciated even more. "The parcel is still available," he said, spreading a hand-drawn map across his desk. 42 acres, technically. Good bottomland along the creek edge, decent elevation on the upper section. It was part of a larger farm that got subdivided when old Henry Marsh passed 2 years ago. "What's the condition of the soil?" Letitia asked. Prout paused in a way that suggested the question had surprised him, which itself told her something. "The bottomland is excellent. Upper section hasn't been worked in a couple of years, so it'll need turning." "What are the lease terms?" He named a figure. She countered. They settled on something in between, with the understanding that if she could demonstrate productive use of the land by the following autumn, a portion of her lease payments would count toward purchase. Prout wrote it out formally, and she read every word before signing, which seemed to surprise him again, pleasantly this time. She found a room to let at the boarding house run by a widow named Marta Hollies, a sturdy German woman who charged fair rates and asked few questions, both qualities Letitia considered virtues. Marta showed her to a room on the second floor with a window that faced east, toward the flat horizon where the sky went pale and enormous in the mornings, and Letitia stood at that window for a long moment after Marta left, looking out at the land she had come to claim some piece of, feeling the particular mixture of fear and certainty that she had come to recognize as the feeling of making the right choice. It was at the general store the following morning, buying provisions and the additional seeds she needed to supplement what she had brought, that Letitia first heard the name Lewis Townsend. She was examining packets of seed corn, comparing varieties with the focused attention of someone who knew what she was looking for, when she heard two women talking on the other side of a shelf of dry goods. She was not trying to listen, but the store was not large and the women were not particularly quiet. "They say he's putting in again this spring," the first woman said, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone sharing information they consider important. "Even after 2 years of nothing. Stubborn as a post," the second woman replied. "My herald says the man's cursed, plain and simple. Some land just won't grow for some people." "It grew fine for the marshes for 20 years, the first woman said, which seemed to conclude the argument in her favor. Letitia set down the seed packet and came around the shelf, not because she had decided to intervene, but because she needed to reach the far counter and the conversation happened to be in her path. The two women looked at her with the frank appraisal that small towns reserve for newcomers. She gave them a polite nod. "Pardon me," she said, reaching past them for a paper bag of beans. "I'm new here. Who is it you're talking about, if you don't mind my asking?" The women exchanged a glance. The first one, a round-faced woman in a blue calico dress, said, "Lewis Townsend. Farms the eastern section right at the creek bend. Lost 2 crops running. People say the land's turned against him." "Land doesn't turn against people," Letitia said, pleasantly enough that it was hard to take offense. "Usually it's the other way around." She paid for her purchases and left the two women to their opinions. It was 3 days before she actually saw Lewis Townsend, and it happened the way most significant things happen, by ordinary coincidence that only becomes significant in retrospect. She had ridden out to her leased parcel that morning on a bay mare she had hired from the livery stable, wanting to walk the ground properly, feel the soil between her fingers, understand what she had committed to. The 42 acres were shaped irregularly, bounded on the south by a shallow creek that still ran with snowmelt, and on the north by a fence line of weathered cedar posts. The eastern edge of her land ran adjacent to a field that was already showing the faint green of early work. Someone had plowed recently, the earth still dark and freshly turned. She was crouching at the creek edge, pressing a handful of bottomland soil between her palms, when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see a man on a gray horse riding along the fence line on the other side. He had the bearing of a man who knew his land the way you know a piece of music you've played many times, with the kind of automatic ease that comes from long familiarity. He was watching the ground more than the horizon, the way a farmer watches, tracking what he knows is there and what ought to be. He saw her at roughly the same moment she straightened up from her crouch, and both of them held still for a second in the way that two strangers encountering each other in an unexpectedly close space sometimes do. "Morning," he said, pulling the gray horse to a stop. His voice was low and even, not unfriendly. "Good morning," she replied, brushing the soil from her hands against her skirt. "I'm the new leaseholder on this parcel, Letitia Fletcher." Something moved across his face, an expression that took her a moment to read. It was the expression of a man who had been told something that surprised him, but was trying not to show that it surprised him. "Lewis Townsend," he said. "I'm your neighbor, it seems." "So it seems." She looked at his field. "You've already turned your soil. You're getting an early start." "I like to start early," he said, and there was something behind those words that she recognized without being able to name it yet, the sound of a man who has decided that the only answer to a series of failures is to work harder and begin sooner and refuse to stop. "So do I," she said. They looked at each other across the fence line for a moment in the bright March sunlight, the wind pulling at her braid and at the brim of his hat, the creek making its quiet sound below them. "Welcome to the county," he said finally, and turned his horse and rode back toward his barn, and she watched him go with a thoughtfulness she could not quite account for. Letitia spent the first weeks of April getting to know her land the way she got to know most things, thoroughly and without shortcuts. She walked every acre of it at different times of day, noting where the morning light came first and where the shadow lingered, marking in her small leather notebook which sections held moisture after rain and which shed it too quickly. She found a section of the upper field where the soil had a grayish cast that suggested alkalinity, and she made a note to work wood ash and compost into it before planting. She found the bottomland to be everything Prout had described, dark and rich, and full of the earthworm activity that is the truest sign of healthy soil. She did most of this work alone, having hired a young Mexican man named Esteban from the south side of town, who worked with her 2 days a week plowing and turning the harder sections of ground. Esteban was 19, quiet and competent, and he had told her plainly on the first day that most of the Anglo farmers in the county would not hire him, a fact she acknowledged with a frankness that seemed to relieve him. She paid him fairly, which she had to explain was non-negotiable when Marta Hollis tried to suggest she could get the same labor for half the price. She became aware, over the first weeks of April, that Louis Townsend was watching her. Not in any way that felt intrusive or uncomfortable. He was a man who worked his own land from before dawn to after dusk, and his field ran adjacent to her upper section, and it was simply that they occupied the same long view of the landscape several times a day. But she noticed that, when she paused in her work to look across the fence, he would sometimes be paused in his, and occasionally their eyes would meet across that distance in the shared silent language of people who understood what hard work in difficult soil actually meant. The first real conversation happened on a Wednesday in the second week of April, at the eastern fence line, where the cedar posts were oldest, and 2 of them had rotted at the base. Louis was replacing the posts. He had 3 new cedar posts in the back of his wagon and a post-hole digger, and he had been at it since early morning. Letitia came up along her side of the fence carrying a coil of wire she had bought at the hardware store, intending to reinforce a section that had gone slack. "Yours are worse on this end," he said by way of greeting, nodding at the sagging wire on her side. He did not say it as a criticism, simply as an observation. "I know," she said, setting the coil down and pulling on her work gloves. "I'm getting to them." He watched her for a moment as she set about stretching the wire with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," he said. "My father's farm in Missouri," she said. "I grew up doing this, all of it." There was a pause in which he went back to his digging and she went back to her stretching, and the morning moved quietly around them. "They told me you lost 2 crops," she said, not looking up from her work. She said it the way you say something that is simply true without the weight of judgment. She heard him stop digging. "That's right," he said. "What did you lose them to?" Another pause. She did not think he would answer, but then he did. "Drought the first year, blight the second, corn blight late season. What are you planting this year?" "Corn again," he said, and there was something almost defiant in it. She looked up at him then. He was looking at her with the particular wariness of a man who expects mockery and has learned to meet it straight on. She just nodded. "Different variety. Bloody Butcher," he said. "It's an older variety, more resistant than the standard dent." "Smart," she said simply, and went back to her wire. He stood there for another moment, then went back to his post hole. After a while he said, "What are you planting?" "Mixed crop," she said. "Corn on the bottomland, wheat and sorghum on the upper section. Kitchen garden near the creek for personal use. And I'm going to try sunflowers on the alkaline section. They tolerate it better than most grains." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a lot for one person." "I have help 2 days a week," she said, "and I'm not afraid of work." "I can see that," he said, and something in his voice had shifted very slightly, something cautious giving a little ground. They worked alongside each other on their respective sides of the fence line for the better part of 2 more hours that morning, sometimes in silence that was entirely comfortable, and sometimes exchanging the kind of practical field talk that has its own intimacy, the kind shared by people who understand each other's work. By the time Letitia coiled the remaining wire and picked up her tools to head back to her near field, she had the clear sense that something had been quietly established between them that she could not yet name but did not need to. Walking back to her horse, she found herself thinking about the way he worked, deliberate and thorough, with none of the reckless speed that sometimes passed for industry. She thought about the expression on his face when he talked about the blight, the careful containment of it, the way he held something painful at a particular distance from his face so that it could not be seen to diminish him. She recognized that distance. She had learned to hold her own griefs that way. It was in the third week of April that Letitia had her first real encounter with the town's opinion of Lewis Townsend, and it made her considerably more serious about the opinion she was forming of her own. She had gone to Hector Drummond's general store for additional seed supplies, and while Drummond was filling her order, he mentioned, with a particularly elaborate casualness, that she might want to know about her neighbor to the east. "I only mention it as a courtesy," Drummond said, setting a sack of seed on the counter with a practiced thump, "since you're new here and all. Lewis Townsend, the man on the adjoining land, he owes me a considerable sum in seed credit. 2 years running of borrowed seed that went nowhere. Some folks would say the man's a bad risk to be associated with. People notice who a person keeps company with." Letitia looked at him. She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that she had found over the years was often more effective than words. "I appreciate you telling me about your own financial arrangements," she said finally, in a tone that was perfectly polite and entirely devastating. "However, what my neighbor does with his own land is his business, and who I choose to be associated with is mine. I'll take the corn seed and the sunflower seed, and if you have sweet potato slips, I'll take 12 of those as well." Hector Drummond's face went through several expressions in quick succession and settled on a stiff smile. He finished filling the order in silence. Letitia paid and left, but she carried the encounter with her out into the April sunshine and held it up to look at it. She thought about what it meant that a man could lose 2 crops to drought and blight, conditions that any farmer could face, and have it turned into a moral failing in the minds of his neighbors. She had seen this before in Missouri, the way misfortune in a small community became something that people needed to belong to someone, needed a name and a face attached to it, because otherwise it might belong to anyone, might belong to them. She thought about Lewis Townsend, and the way he had said "bloody butcher corn" with that quiet defiance, and she felt something warm and certain settle in her chest like a coal catching. She began to find reasons to work near the shared fence line. She would not have admitted this to anyone, not at first. She told herself it was practical. The fence needed ongoing attention. The soil on her side near the boundary was particularly good. But the truth was simpler and more honest than that, as it usually is when you finally let yourself look at it. She liked being near him. She liked the sound of his work, the particular rhythm of a man who knew what he was doing and did it without waste. She liked the way he talked about plants and soil with the same care and attention other men devoted to horses or machinery. And she liked, most of all, the way he talked to her as though her knowledge was real. In 1878, in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, this was not nothing. This was, in fact, something considerable. There were men in town who were pleasant enough to Letitia in the abstract, but became visibly uncomfortable the moment she demonstrated specific agricultural knowledge. There were men who talked around her at the feed store, directing their questions to the space just to her left where a man was presumably standing. There was a general assumption, voiced sometimes and often just lived in the air around her, that a woman farming alone was an aberration to be tolerated rather than a person to be reckoned with. Lewis Townsend did not seem to share this assumption, and the absence of it was striking in a way that she had not entirely expected. The first time he asked her direct opinion on something was in late April, when he was deciding whether to add a second water furrow along his north section or rely on the natural slope of the land. He came to the fence line one afternoon and stood there for a moment, looking at her upper wheat field with a particular focused attention, and then he said, "You've been looking at the watershed on this slope. What did you decide about your north runoff?" She had been deciding exactly this same thing, and she told him what she had concluded, that the natural slope was sufficient if you worked with it rather than against it, but that a single lateral furrow at the midpoint would prevent pooling during a heavy rain without disrupting the drainage pattern. He listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. "That's what I was thinking," he said, "but it's good to hear it from someone who has eyes on the same land." "You could come over and look at mine," she said. "It'll tell you more than looking from across the fence." He came over the following morning, and they walked her north field together, both of them reading the ground the way experienced farmers do, with their feet as much as their eyes, feeling the give and firmness of the soil, noticing the way the grass grew in the untouched margins. They talked for 2 hours about drainage and soil composition and the particular challenges of the alkaline upper section. And by the end of it, Letitia had 3 new ideas for her own planting plan, and the feeling, certain and warm, that this was a man who saw the world the way she did, through the intimate detail of growing things. He thanked her before he left, formally and sincerely, as though she had given him something of real value, because she had. "You're welcome to ask anything," she told him, and meant it in every direction at once. The first time they had supper together was an accident that became a choice. It was early May, and Letitia had been working a long day on the bottomland, turning in the compost she had been building since March, and she had made a simple supper at the small camp stove she kept in her field equipment shed, an old stovepipe structure that had come with the lease and which she had cleaned and made workable. She had made biscuits and salt pork and coffee, more than enough for one person, and Lewis had come riding past on the way to check his far water trough, and she had simply said, "I have more supper than I need," and he had looked at the stove and the coffee and said, after a moment, "I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," she said. "Sit down." He tied his horse and sat on the old bench outside the shed door, and she handed him a plate and a tin cup, and they ate together in the long May evening, with the light going gold across the fields and the creek making its sound below them. The conversation moved from the practical to the personal with the natural ease that comes from 2 people who have already established that they can talk honestly. He told her about the first harvest, the drought year, with the careful, measured tone of someone recounting something that is past and dealt with. He told her about riding out to his field every morning that summer to find the corn a little shorter, a little yellower, the soil a little harder, and knowing there was nothing to be done but watch it go. He told her about the spring of hope that had followed, the beautiful June corn and then the July blight, and the look on Hector Drummond's face when he had come to discuss the outstanding credit. He did not say that it had broken something in him, but she heard it underneath everything he said, the sound of something that had bent very far and was deciding, with deliberate effort, not to break. She told him about her father's farm and the years of rent that consumed everything, about her mother dying when she was 16, and the way the house had simply gotten quieter, and she and her father had gone on because there was nothing else to do. She told him about Dodge City and Mrs. Albright, who had been a difficult woman and a fair employer, and who had died in February, leaving Letitia with the sudden space of a life to refill. She told him about the newspaper notice and the 42 acres and the feeling of walking the bottomland for the first time and pressing the soil between her palms. "I knew it was good land," she said. "I could tell immediately." "It is good land," he agreed. "So is yours," she said, and looked at him steadily. 2 bad years doesn't change the soil. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the field in the evening light. "The town doesn't see it that way," he said. "The town isn't farming your land," she said. "You are." He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen from him before, something that had been held carefully closed, beginning just slightly to open. She held his gaze without looking away, and the evening settled around them and the creek went on making its sound, and somewhere a meadowlark called once from the fence post across the field. "You're not like anyone who's come to this county in a while," he said. "Is that good or bad?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved. "Good," he said. "I think it's very good." May moved into June with all the particular beauty of a plain spring, the grass going intensely green, the wildflowers running riot along the creek margins, the sky performing its enormous drama of clouds and light and wind. The crops were coming up. Both of them watched them with the specific anxiety of people who understood exactly what was at stake and had enough experience to know that hope was not a strategy, but was also not nothing. Lewis's bloody butcher corn was pushing through the soil on schedule, the stalks compact and sturdy in a way that already looked different from the more delicate dent corn of the previous years. He had also planted a section of sorghum on his advice from Letitia, who had pointed out that sorghum's drought tolerance made it a sensible hedge against the uncertainty that the plains climate had such a long history of delivering. Letitia's bottomland corn was thriving, the rich soil doing exactly what she had known it would. The wheat on the upper section was coming in evenly, pale green rows stretching away from the fence line toward the north. The alkaline section had been prepared with the wood ash and compost she had worked in through April, and she had planted her sunflowers there in double rows, their fat seeds just beginning to push up their hooked seedling heads. She noticed, in this period, that Lewis had begun riding by more often than strictly necessary, and that these rides tended to occur in the hours when she was working in the visible sections of her field. She noticed this with a pleasure she did not bother to conceal from herself, though she kept it carefully out of her expression when she looked up from her work to greet him. She was 26, and she had not been foolish about men, which was to say she had been careful with her heart without being cold about it, and she understood the difference between a man paying attention because he wanted something and a man paying attention because he could not help himself. With Lewis it was the second kind. She was sure of it, and she knew that he was sure of nothing yet, that he was a man who had learned not to reach for things too quickly, not because he was timid but because he had reached for things before and had them rot in his hands, and the body remembers that kind of disappointment even when the mind has made its peace with it. So she let things move at the pace they were moving and tended her crops and made her supper, and trusted that the season would say what it had to say in its own time. It was on a June evening, warm and still, when something shifted. They had taken to meeting at the fence line most evenings after the day's work was done, ostensibly to discuss the progress of their respective fields, practically to simply be together in the long gold light. On this particular evening, Lewis had brought along a copy of an agricultural pamphlet he had received from the State Extension Service about new approaches to soil amendment, and they sat on the fence rail, the evening star just appearing in the western sky, reading the relevant sections and talking them over. She noticed he had a habit when he was absorbed in something of running his thumb along the edge of whatever he was holding, a book, a fence post, a folded paper, a slow, thoughtful motion. She noticed the shape of his hands, strong and calloused and careful. She noticed that when he looked up from the pamphlet to say something to her, he held her eyes for just a beat longer than was strictly required by conversation. "Letitia," he said, and stopped. She waited. "I know things are complicated," he said. "The way I'm situated with the debt and the talk in town, I know it isn't what any sensible woman would want to walk into." "Are you asking me what I want?" she said. He met her eyes. "I'm trying to," he said. She folded the pamphlet carefully and set it on the rail between them. "Lewis," she said, "I grew up on a failing farm in Missouri. I managed a difficult widow's household for 3 years. I have leased 42 acres on my own with borrowed money and no certainty about the outcome. I have never once in my life chosen the safe thing over the true thing." He was very still. "I don't care about the talk in town," she said. "I care about the man I have supper with who talks about soil like it's something that deserves to be understood. I care about the man who got back on his land after 2 years that would have driven most men to the railroad, or the bottle, or both. That is the man I have an opinion about, not the story Clyde Barrick tells at the saloon." Lewis looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not seen from him before. He laughed. Not a polite laugh or a nervous one, but a real one surprised out of him, warm and genuine, and it completely changed his face, took 10 years off it and replaced the careful containment with something open and alive. "You know about Clyde Barrick," he said. "I know everything that's said in this town," she said. "I am a woman living alone, and women who live alone learn to listen carefully." He was still smiling, and she was smiling too, and the evening was warm and the star was brighter now, and the fields lay all around them in the last light, growing things growing. "May I come to supper tomorrow?" he asked, and the simplicity of it after everything else was perfect. "You may," she said. He came to supper the next evening with a jar of her favorite preserves that he had somehow learned she liked from a conversation with Marta Hollies, a detail that told her he had been paying attention for longer than he had let on. She had made a proper meal, not a camp stove supper, but an actual dinner on the small iron stove she had moved into the equipment shed, which was becoming something very close to a second home. There was roasted chicken and new potatoes from her kitchen garden and cornbread from her own meal, and they sat across from each other at the small wooden table she had acquired from the Caldwell Creek auction, and they ate and talked, and the conversation went everywhere that good conversations go when two people have been waiting to have it properly. He told her about his parents, who had come out from Ohio when he was a boy, his father a determined man with faith in the future of the plains, his mother a practical woman who had grown the best kitchen garden in the county, until she died of fever when Lewis was 22. His father had gone back to Ohio 2 years later, leaving Lewis the land and a firm handshake, and the specific loneliness of a man who has inherited what he loves without the people who helped him love it. She told him that she understood that particular loneliness from a different angle, the loneliness of a woman who knows exactly what she wants and finds that wanting it clearly and openly is itself somehow unusual in the world she lives in. "Most people want me to want less," she said, "to want a safe and smaller life. I've never wanted less," he said. "Just the thing that was promised, which is that if you work the land honestly and well, it comes back to you." "It will," she said. "This time it will." He looked at her across the table. "You say that like you know it." "I do know it," she said. "The bottom soil on your east field is the best I have seen in 2 counties. You have chosen the right variety for the blight resistance. You have added the sorghum as a hedge. You have started early and worked carefully. The drought last year was a drought, not a judgment. The blight was a fungus, not a curse." "When you say it," he said slowly, "I can almost believe it." "You should believe it because it's true," she said, "not because I say it." "Those two things are not mutually exclusive," he said, and looked at her in a way that was no longer careful at all. After supper they walked along the creek in the warm June dark, and he told her the names of the stars the way his mother had taught them to him, not the formal Latin names but the old Ohio farm names, the haymaker's star, the corn star, the reaper's bend. She told him the Missouri names her father had used, which were different and sometimes contradicted his entirely, and they laughed about that, the sky being full of competing names for the same light. He took her hand as they walked, simply and naturally, as though it were something they had always done. Her hand in his felt like a fact. It felt like something that had always been true and had simply required the two of them to catch up to it. July came in hot and dry, and it was the hottest, driest July that Caldwell Creek had experienced since 1874, and this was not a small thing. The temperature climbed into the high 90s for days at a stretch, the sky going hard and white at midday, the creek dropping to half its usual level. Letitia checked her bottomland corn every morning with controlled anxiety, watching the leaves for the first signs of curling that would indicate serious drought stress. Lewis was up before dawn every day, routing what water he could from his stock tank to his field through a series of channels. He dug himself in the brutally hot mornings. He looked exhausted when Letitia saw him in the evenings, dark circles under his eyes, the skin of his face tightened by sun and worry. But he worked with the same steady deliberateness that she had come to understand was his fundamental response to everything the world put in front of him. She saw the doubt in him sometimes, in the evenings when they sat together on the creek bank, watching the water level. He would look at his fields with the expression of a man waiting for a blow that has not yet landed, but that experience has taught him is coming. She would feel the weight of it on him and would not try to talk it away, because she respected him too much to offer comfort that was not honest. Instead, she helped him. On the days she had completed her own necessary irrigation work, she would come over his fence line with her own water containers and assist with his most critical sections. He protested this the first time, with a specific and uncomfortable kind of pride that she recognized as the pride of a man who had been dependent on charity before and found it diminishing. "This is not charity," she told him directly. "I am your neighbor and your friend, and I am helping you because that is what you do for the people you care about. If you need to make it equitable, you can help me harvest the wheat in August." He looked at her for a moment. "Your what?" he said. "My wheat. It'll be ready in August. Harvesting alone would take me twice as long. You can bring your scythe." "All right," he said, and something in his shoulders came down an inch. Esteban also helped, not because anyone asked him to, but because he arrived on a July morning and looked at the situation with the practical eye of a young man who had grown up in a farming family, where you helped your neighbors as a matter of course, not because someone organized it. He said nothing about it, and helped with the water channels, and Letitia paid him extra for the additional days, and he nodded and went back to work. In the first week of August, with the heat still pressing down, something began to happen in Lewis's corn that none of them had expected quite so visibly. The Bloody Butcher variety, the older, more resistant corn that Lewis had chosen with such deliberate care, was doing what it had been bred for. While the neighboring farms in the county were showing drought damage, yellowing leaves and stunted ears, Lewis's corn stood in its rows with a particular stubbornness that was almost personal. The ears were forming, not perfectly, not without some stress from the heat, but forming firmly, and with the kind of density that the older varieties were known for. Letitia stood at his fence line one August morning and looked at his field with something that started as admiration and became, in her chest, something closer to joy. When Lewis came out to do his morning check and found her standing there looking at his corn, he stopped beside her and they both looked at the field together. "It's going to make it," she said. He was quiet. She glanced at him and saw that his jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was containing something. "I think so," he said. His voice was not quite steady. She did not say anything else about it. She simply reached across and put her hand over his where it rested on the fence rail, and they stood there together in the August morning looking at rows of Bloody Butcher corn that was going to make it, and the silence between them was the most eloquent thing either of them had said since March. She brought up something she had been thinking about for a while. She had been doing sums in her leather notebook, running the numbers on what a combined harvest might look like. Her corn and wheat and sorghum, his corn and sorghum, if both crops came through well. She had also done the sums on what it would take to clear Lewis's debt to Drummond and settle his outstanding tax payment and what would remain after that. She had done these sums carefully and several times and had arrived at the same conclusion each time. "I want to talk to you about something," she said that evening after supper, sitting on the bench outside her equipment shed with the August stars enormous overhead. He turned his face toward her, attentive. She laid out what she had figured. The combined yield, if both harvests came in at even a modest grade, would exceed what either of them could achieve alone. The railroad buyer in Wichita was paying good prices for corn this year because the general drought across the plains had reduced supply. Her bottomland corn, grown in richer soil, would grade higher and bring a premium. If they sold through the same buyer together in volume, they could negotiate a better per bushel price than either could get alone. "I'm not suggesting a formal partnership," she said, watching his face, "unless you want that. I'm saying that if we harvest together and sell together this autumn, we will both come out better than alone." He was looking at her in a way she could not entirely read, something moving behind his eyes. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because you're my neighbor," she said, "and because I believe in your crop, and because the town has been waiting for 2 years to watch you fail, and I find I am considerably interested in denying them that." A slow smile crossed his face, the real one, the one that changed everything. "That last part," he said. "Yes. That last part sounds like exactly the kind of reason I should be grateful for." "Also the first two parts," she said. "Yes," he said. "Also the first two parts." He reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair away from her face with the backs of his fingers, a gesture so gentle and natural that it did not feel like a first gesture at all, but like something they had been doing forever. She turned her face slightly into his hand, and he curved his palm against her cheek, and they were both very still for a moment. "Letitia," he said, her name in his voice a different thing than it was in anyone else's, weighted and careful and warm. "Yes," she said. He kissed her then, in the August starlight with the fields all around them growing their way toward something. And it was a first kiss that felt like a homecoming, like arriving somewhere you had been heading without knowing it, the particular sweetness of rightness after a long uncertainty. The harvest of 1878 came in on a warm September morning, the sky that brilliant deep blue of plains autumn that seems painted rather than real, and it came in gold. Letitia's bottomland corn was extraordinary. The rich soil had done everything she had asked of it, and the ears were heavy and dense and beautifully formed. The wheat from the upper section had come through the summer heat better than she had dared hope, the grain full and clean. The sorghum was reliable and solid. The sunflowers on the alkaline section, which she had planted almost as an experiment, had grown to enormous height and were fat with seeds that would press into oil. Lewis's bloody butcher corn was a revelation. The stalks were tall, the ears large and dense, the grain the deep red-purple color that gave the variety its name. It stood in its rows in the September morning like something triumphant, like proof of a point that had been waiting 2 years to be made. When he walked into the first rows to pull an ear and hold it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, Letitia was standing at the fence line watching him, and she saw him stand very still for a long moment with the ear of corn in his hands, his head bent. She climbed through the fence without invitation and walked out to where he stood. She put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades, and he turned and pulled her into his arms without saying anything, and she held him, both of them standing in the middle of the corn rows with the September sky overhead, and she felt the long tension in him finally let go. 3 years, he said against her hair. 3 years of this land. And now it's come up gold, she said. He held her tighter for a moment and then stepped back and looked at her with wet eyes that he did not try to hide, which was the most honest thing she had ever seen a man do. "We should get to work," he said. "Yes, we should," she agreed. The harvest took 10 days, both of them working from dawn to dusk, with Esteban's help and the additional help of a young man named Thomas who worked the livery stable and had asked Lewis shyly in August if there would be work at harvest time. Lewis had said yes without hesitation, and Thomas proved to be a hard worker who kept up without complaint. They loaded the corn and wheat onto Lewis's larger wagon and took it together to Caldwell Creek's grain elevator, and from there it went with the other autumn shipments to Wichita on the railroad. The price per bushel was better than either of them had projected, driven up by the general regional shortfall. Letitia's bottomland corn graded premium, as she had expected. Lewis's bloody butcher came in at top grade for feed corn, a grade it had not achieved in the county before. When the payment came through the bank in mid-October, Letitia sat down with her notebook, and Lewis sat across from her at Marta Hollis's kitchen table, which Marta had offered for the occasion with the practical warmth of a woman who understood what was happening and approved of it entirely, and they went through the numbers together. The total was more than either had carried in years. After the payment to Lewis's outstanding debt with Hector Drummond, a payment Lewis made in full and in person on a Tuesday morning with Letitia standing quietly beside him while Drummond's tight smile became confused and then disappeared, and after the tax settlement with the county, and after Letitia's lease payment to Sela's Prute, which included the portion that would count toward purchase, there was enough remaining to plan for the following year on proper footing, with bought seed and no borrowed credit, and to make certain necessary repairs to both their properties that had been deferred too long. Lewis paid Drummond without saying anything extra. He did not need to. The money itself was the complete and final statement. On the walk home from Drummond's store, Lewis kept Letitia's hand in his, and people on the main street of Caldwell Creek could see them walking together in the October sunlight, which was very much the point. Clyde Barrick was standing outside the feed store and watched them pass with an expression that went through several stages, and Lewis touched the brim of his hat to Barrick without breaking stride, which Letitia thought was exactly the right amount of acknowledgement. It was 2 weeks later, on an October evening of particular golden clarity, the cottonwoods along the creek gone entirely yellow, that Lewis asked her to marry him. He had thought about it for weeks, she later understood, had turned the words over and arranged them carefully in the way he did everything. But when the moment came, he did not use the prepared words. He simply stopped walking on the path along the creek and turned to face her and said, "I love you. I know it's only been since March. I know my situation is not straightforward and I still have work to do to be the man I want to be in this county. But I know this with the same certainty I know about soil and seasons. I would like to spend my life with you. I would like to plant every crop and survive every drought beside you. I am asking you to be my wife." Letitia looked at him in the golden October light for long enough that a less certain man might have grown nervous, but she was not making him wait out of cruelty. She was simply taking the moment in its fullness, holding it, understanding what it was. A man who had been broken at and had refused to break, asking her to build something with him. A man who talked about soil like it was sacred and kissed her in starlight and paid his debts in full and touched her face like she was something worth being careful with. "Yes," she said. "With everything I have, yes." He put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her under the yellow cottonwoods while the creek ran below them, and the October sky went orange at the horizon. And it was a kiss that was both a beginning and an arrival, and the whole golden world seemed to lean in around them. They were married in the Caldwell Creek Methodist Church on the 5th of November, 1878, by Reverend James Caldwell, the grandson of the town's founder, on a day when the sky was that particular pale blue of late autumn and the air had enough cold in it to make your breath show. Letitia wore a cream-colored wool dress she had made herself over 3 weeks, with a collar of small buttons that she had ordered from the dry goods catalog, and which Marta Hollies declared were the finest thing to arrive in Caldwell Creek in a year. She wore her hair up for the occasion, and Lewis looked at her when she came down the aisle of the small church with the expression of a man who has been prepared to be happy, and is somewhat undone by how much he actually is. Lewis wore his good dark coat and had his hair cut by the barber on the morning of the wedding, and stood at the altar with the composed stillness that was native to him. But Letitia could see from 10 feet away that his hands were not entirely steady, and she found that she loved him more for it. There were perhaps 20 people in attendance. Marta Holly sat in the front row and cried with open satisfaction. Esteban came and sat in the back with his hat on his knee, respectful and pleased. Silas Prout came, which surprised Letitia and touched her. Thomas from the livery came with his mother. Several of the neighboring farm families attended, the ones who had been watching Lewis's third crop all summer with a quietly revised opinion. Clyde Barrick did not come, which nobody mentioned. Reverend Caldwell read the words and Lewis said his, in a voice that was steady and certain and low, as though he were making a statement about something he had thought through completely and arrived at with full understanding. Letitia said hers in the clear, direct way she said everything important, looking at him without wavering, meaning each word with the whole of her. When he kissed her in the little church with 20 people watching, someone started clapping, and it spread, and the sound of it was the best sound that old church had heard in years, which Reverend Caldwell later said in his journal, in his private notes, adding that he had married couples of every variety in 20 years of ministry, and had learned to tell within the first minute of speaking to a pair whether the thing between them was real. And that Lewis Townsend and Letitia Fletcher were the most straightforwardly, obviously real thing he had seen in quite some time. They spent the first night of their marriage at Lewis's farmhouse, which Letitia had been helping to make livable over the preceding weeks, bringing over pieces of furniture from her equipment shed and the boarding house, adding the practical warmth of someone who understood how to make a space genuinely inhabited. The house was simple, 2 rooms downstairs and a loft, with a good stone fireplace and a kitchen that had good bones under the years of bachelor neglect. She had scrubbed it and mended what needed mending, and arranged it with the particular intelligence of a woman who knows that a home is made by attention and intention, not by expense. Lewis had spent 2 weeks repairing the porch steps and the kitchen window that had swollen in its frame, and the loft ladder that had wobbled for 3 years. He had done these things without saying anything about it directly, but Letitia had noticed each repair as it happened, and the accumulation of them was its own eloquence, the language of a man preparing his house to be a home. They stood together in the kitchen on that first married night, the fire going in the fireplace, the house warm against the November cold, and the particular stillness of 2 people who have arrived somewhere they have been heading and are taking a moment to understand it. "Well," Lewis said, looking at her in the firelight, "here we are." "Here we are," she agreed. He moved across the kitchen and took her hands and held them, looking down at them for a moment, her practical calloused hands in his, and then he looked up at her face with an expression that was so unguarded and full of feeling that she felt it like warmth in the center of her chest. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever comes, I am aware that you are the best thing that has happened to this farm and to me, and I intend to deserve that for the rest of my life." "You already do," she said, "but I appreciate the intention." He pulled her close and she rested her head against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, and the fire crackled and the November wind moved outside the windows, and the fields lay dark and quiet around the house, resting through the winter, holding their potential until spring, the way good things do. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was cold and clear and productive in a different way than summer, the productive way of plans and preparations made in good time without urgency. Lewis used the winter months to properly repair the barn roof, which had leaked for 2 years, and to build a new equipment shed on the eastern side of the property, larger and better than the one Letitia had been using on her leased parcel. They talked through the spring planting over long evenings by the fire, Letitia's leather notebook open on the table between them, working out rotations and varieties, and timing with the pleasure of 2 people who find genuine joy in planning something they are both excellent at. Letitia continued the lease on her 42 acres through the winter, as the lease agreement required continued use, and she and Lewis worked out a management plan that integrated her parcel and his into a single larger farm operation, about 200 acres in total, which was enough to be genuinely productive at scale while still manageable for 2 people with seasonal help. She wrote to Silas Prout in January about the lease-to-own conversion, and Prout, who had developed a genuine respect for her methods, worked out the purchase terms with a cooperative spirit that she suspected owed something to having watched the autumn harvest numbers come in. There was a conversation in January with Hector Drummond. Lewis had gone to the general store for winter provisions, and Drummond had made some remark, apparently, about whether Lewis expected to carry credit again through the spring. Lewis had come home in a controlled quiet that Letitia recognized as the specific quiet of a man who has held his temper by an act of significant will, and she asked him what had happened, and he told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she put on her coat and drove into town the next morning and went to the general store. Drummond was behind his counter and looked up with surprise when she came in and set her gloves down on the counter in the deliberate way she set things down when she meant them to stay. "Mr. Drummond," she said, My husband came in yesterday for winter provisions and was spoken to in a way that was neither warranted nor professional. I want you to know that we will be purchasing our supplies this winter from Mr. Garfield at the hardware and feed, and we will be recommending the same to the Estrada family and the Whitmore family, both of whom we work with regularly. If and when you decide to conduct business in a manner consistent with simple decency, we will be glad to return our custom. Good morning. She picked up her gloves and left. Drummond stood behind his counter for a long moment. He was not, at the core of him, a bad man, simply a cautious one who had allowed caution to calcify into cruelty over the years, and the encounter with Letitia Townsend left him with the particular uncomfortable feeling of someone who has looked in a mirror and not loved what they saw. He thought about it for 3 days and then went to the Townsend farm one afternoon and knocked on the door and told Lewis, with a stiffness that was the best he could manage in the direction of humility, that he had not meant to give offense and that the Townsends were welcome in his store. Lewis shook his hand and said they appreciated that. Letitia made coffee and served it without saying a single word about the previous week, which was the most gracious thing she could have done, and which Drummond understood perfectly. By spring of 1879, Letitia's purchase of the 42-acre parcel was formalized, and she and Lewis were farming their consolidated land together with a clarity of plan and a depth of shared knowledge that the county had not quite seen before in the same place. They had decided over the winter to add a small herd of cattle, 6 animals, which would graze the fallow sections and provide manure for the compost cycle that Letitia had been building systematically since her first spring on the land. Lewis had spent a winter morning in December reading her notebook on soil amendments with the intense focus he gave to important things, and had come to supper that evening saying that he thought she had figured something out that most of the county's farmers were missing, and that the bottomland corn yield from the previous autumn was not a coincidence. She had kissed him for that, which he had found so thoroughly acceptable that he had set the notebook down and devoted the rest of the evening to other things. The spring of 1879 planting went in early and well, both of them knowing by now the particular rhythms of their combined land, where to push early and where to wait, which sections needed more working and which were already ready. Lewis had added a section of new corn variety that Letitia had read about in the agricultural correspondence she maintained with a soil science professor at the State College in Manhattan, Kansas, a correspondence she had begun on her own initiative in the autumn and which had proved enormously useful. The professor, a man named Dr. Holbrook, had written back with real engagement and had sent several pamphlets and a detailed letter about soil chemistry that Lewis had read over 3 evenings, stopping occasionally to say something like, "This is what I was seeing in the alkaline section and could not name." It was in April of 1879, on an evening of young green and soft wind, that Letitia told Lewis she was expecting their first child. She told him at the kitchen table after supper, directly and without preamble, because that was how she said things that mattered, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions she had not seen from him before, surprise and then a full and complete joy that expanded slowly across his features like sunrise, unhurried and entire. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands and held them to his chest, his heart beating fast under her palms, and looked up at her face with the kind of expression that makes words seem inadequate to the occasion. "Letitia," he said. "Yes," she said, already smiling. "Are you well? How are you feeling? What do you need? Should you be working as much? I can take on your—" "I am perfectly well," she said with great affection. "And the day I stop working the south section because I am expecting a child is the day I am prepared to have a very different conversation with you, and you will lose that conversation." He laughed and pulled her into his arms, still crouching, his face against her hair, and she felt him shaking slightly with the contained enormity of it. "I am going to be someone's father," he said, into her hair. "You are going to be an excellent father," she said. You are patient and you work hard and you know how to wait for things and take care of them properly. Those are the most important skills." He pulled back to look at her. "You have a very agricultural view of parenting." "I have a very agricultural view of most things," she said. "It has served me extremely well." The summer of 1879 was the opposite of the summer before it, mild and well-watered, rain coming at the right intervals in the right quantities, the kind of summer that makes a farmer feel that the land is in a generous mood, and that everything you have done is being validated in the most straightforward possible way. The crops came in beautifully. The cattle were growing well. The kitchen garden behind the house, which Letitia tended with particular care, and which had become the most extravagantly productive kitchen garden in the immediate county, was producing more than they could use, and she had begun sharing the surplus with the Estrada family to the south, the family that Esteban belonged to, and with old Mrs. Barrick, who was Clyde Barrick's mother and who was entirely different from her son. A sharp, quiet woman of 70 who had a genuine appreciation for good vegetables and a dry humor that Letitia enjoyed very much. The harvest of 1879 was better than 1878. Both of them knew it when the numbers came in from the grain elevator, and both of them stood in the kitchen looking at the figures with the feeling of people who have staked something and been answered. In the last week of October, 1879, their son was born. He came into the world in the farmhouse on a cold, clear night with the help of Dr. Margaret Carver, Caldwell Creek's physician, one of the few women practicing medicine in Kansas at the time, and someone for whom Letitia had developed enormous respect over the months of her pregnancy. The labor was long but not complicated, and Lewis sat outside the bedroom door through all of it, which Dr. Carver said was entirely fine and which Letitia could hear, his steady presence on the other side of the wood, and which was exactly what she wanted. When Dr. Carver opened the door and told him he could come in, Lewis entered the bedroom with the expression of a man walking into something entirely new, and found Letitia sitting up in bed, tired and radiant and certain, holding a small red-faced squalling boy wrapped in the white blanket Marta Hollies had sent over 3 weeks prior as a gift. Lewis sat on the edge of the bed and Letitia placed the boy in his arms, and he held his son with the careful gravity of a man handling something infinitely precious, and the child stopped squalling and looked up at him with the unfocused, searching gaze of the very new. "He's real," Lewis said, in a voice that had lost all its composure entirely. "He is absolutely real," Letitia said. "What shall we call him?" They had talked about this, of course, at length over the previous months. But naming a person you are holding is different from naming one in the abstract. "Daniel," Letitia said. "After my father." Lewis looked at her. His father's name had been Daniel as well. He had told her this once in passing in a conversation about Ohio, and she had remembered. He understood that she remembered and had held it here for this moment, and the understanding of it opened something in him that was very large. "Daniel Townsend," he said. "Daniel Fletcher Townsend," she said firmly. "Both." "Daniel Fletcher Townsend," he agreed. He looked down at the boy again. The boy looked back. "Hello, Daniel," Lewis said. "You have no idea yet what a remarkable woman your mother is. I look forward to watching you figure it out." Letitia made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and he leaned over and kissed her forehead, and she leaned against him, and the three of them were together in the November night with the fire going downstairs and the Kansas sky enormous outside the window. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was the fullest winter Letitia had ever lived through. Full of the particular intensity of a first infant, whose needs were immediate and constant and absolute, and whose presence transformed a house in ways that no amount of furniture or arrangement can. Lewis, who had worried quietly throughout the pregnancy about whether he would know what to do, turned out to be exactly as Letitia had predicted, patient and careful and fully present. The kind of father who sits for an hour watching a sleeping baby with the same focused attention he gave to a newly planted field. seeing potential and feeling the specific weight of responsibility without letting it become fear. There was a morning in December when Daniel was 6 weeks old and had been particularly wakeful through the night, and Letitia was at the kitchen table at dawn with her coffee and her notebook, doing the seed order for spring with the kind of focused determination of a woman who had learned that the practical work of the world did not pause for exhaustion, when Lewis came downstairs with Daniel asleep on his shoulder, moving with the slow, careful walk of a man carrying sleeping treasure, and set the coffee pot on the stove to heat without waking the baby, and sat down across from her and reached across the table and turned one page of her seed catalog to the winter wheat section he had been reading the night before, and said, quietly, because of Daniel, "I think we should increase the winter wheat by 30% this spring. Prices are up, and the South Field rotation is ready for it." She looked up at him across the table, this man with their sleeping son on his shoulder in the gray December morning, discussing next year's winter wheat with the same complete seriousness he brought to everything that mattered, and she felt a love for him so large and specific and permanent that it seemed for a moment to encompass the whole kitchen and the whole farm and the whole of the flat, dark plain outside the frosted windows. 35%, she said. The South Field will support it. He looked at her with that smile, the real one. 35, he agreed. Spring of 1880 came in well, and they planted their expanded operation with the efficiency of people who had been doing this together long enough to have developed a genuine working fluency, the kind of fluency that looks effortless from outside, but is actually built from 1,000 small decisions made in close collaboration over 2 years. Esteban was now working 4 days a week for them, full-time through planting and harvest, and had brought his younger brother Marco into the work as well. And Lewis had spoken to Silas Prout about the possibility of a small wage advance that would allow Esteban to buy the milk cow he had been saving for, and Prout had arranged it. And Letitia had said nothing about this publicly, but had made the excellent tamales that Esteban's mother sent over at Christmas last considerably longer than they might have otherwise. The county was changing. The railroad's presence continued to pull in settlers, and the plains were being homesteaded with increasing density, which was not without its complications, because the land had always had people on it. And the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples who had lived and hunted these plains had been pushed further and further from their traditional territories through the 1860s and 1870s by a combination of federal policy and violence that Lewis talked about with a bluntness and discomfort that Letitia respected. He had seen a Cheyenne family camping near the creek in the autumn of 1876, moving through, and had left corn and dried meat at the edge of his property without making it into a transaction, which said something essential about him that she had thought about more than once. The injustice of what had been done to the peoples of the plains was not abstract to anyone who lived on land that had been theirs within living memory. It sat in the ground with the history, the way many hard things sit in the ground, present and not fully accountable, requiring at minimum an honest acknowledgement that the people whose names this land had known before the settlers came were owed something that had not been given and could not be fully repaid. Lewis said this simply and directly when it came up, without drama or performance, and Letitia agreed, and they raised their son in a house where these things were acknowledged plainly, because pretending otherwise would have been a form of dishonesty they were both constitutionally incapable of. The harvest of 1880 was the best yet. The winter wheat alone was a revelation. The 35% increase in acreage combined with an ideal growing season, producing a yield that the Caldwell Creek grain elevator had not seen from a single farm operation in several years. The corn was strong, the sorghum dependable. The small cattle herd had doubled to 12 animals, and the quality of the beef was being remarked upon at the county fair that September, where Lewis entered 2 steers and won a second place ribbon from a panel of judges, who included 3 men who had once called him cursed, a fact that gave Letitia a quiet and specific satisfaction she did not try to suppress. At the county fair that September, at the produce tables where farmers displayed their best, Letitia entered a collection of her kitchen garden's products: the extraordinary tomatoes from the South Bed, dried herbs from the creek margin, preserved vegetables in the glass jars that she had been packing with that same care she had brought to Caldwell Creek in her canvas sack 2.5 years before. She won the blue ribbon for preserved goods without any real competition. She held the ribbon for a moment and looked at it, and then looked across the fair ground to where Lewis was standing with Daniel on his hip, 18 months old and fascinated by the noise and color of the fair. And Lewis was watching her with the expression she had come to know best of all his expressions, the one that was simply full. She walked across to him and tucked the ribbon into Daniel's small reaching hand, and the baby waved it with great enthusiasm, and Lewis put his free arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side, and the September fair went on around them, the sounds of the plains autumn fair, the bellowing cattle and the calling vendors and the fiddle music starting up from the dance platform, and the three of them stood together in the middle of it all with the solidity of people who know exactly where they are. In the spring of 1881, Letitia told Lewis she was expecting again. He received this news with the same enormous joy as the first time, though slightly more composed, which she teased him about gently, and he pointed out that composure and joy were not mutually exclusive, and she said that was very true and kissed him. This pregnancy was different from the first, not harder exactly, but the work of the farm was more demanding now that their operation had grown, and there were days in the summer of 1881 when she had to sit down in the middle of a field row and acknowledge that her body required something, which went against every instinct she had developed over 30 years of simply pushing through. Lewis managed this with a calibration she found genuinely admirable, checking on her with a regularity that was concerned without being intrusive, never suggesting she do less unless she was already doing less and just not admitting it, at which point he simply did the work himself without comment. He had expanded the farmhouse that spring, adding a proper room on the eastern side with good windows and a separate door to the outside, which he said was for storage, but which she understood from the dimensions was clearly a room for a child. He did this work himself over evenings and Sundays in late winter and early spring, and she heard the sound of his hammer from the kitchen while she prepared supper, the sound of him building something for their family, and there was nothing in the world she would have traded it for. The second child was born in November of 1881, another boy, who arrived with somewhat more urgency than his brother and considerably more noise, immediately demonstrating a vocal capacity that Dr. Carver said she had rarely encountered in a newborn, and that suggested strong lungs and a determined temperament. They named him James, after Reverend Caldwell, who had married them, who was entirely moved by the honor and said so in a somewhat lengthy Sunday sermon that Lewis summarized afterward as the good Reverend seemed pleased. Daniel, now 2 years old and a person of very definite opinions, greeted his brother with a solemnity that slowly transformed into fascination as the weeks passed, developing a habit of standing next to the cradle and talking to James in a continuous low monologue about things he considered interesting, which included the dog, the chickens, the big horses, the smaller horses, and something he called corn go big, which Lewis said required no translation. By the winter of 1881, the Townsend farm was prosperous, not extravagantly so, not the kind of wealth that becomes its own problem, but solidly, genuinely prosperous in the way of people who have worked intelligently and cared for their land and made good decisions through difficult times. The debt to Drummond was long since cleared. The tax account was current. Letitia owned her 42 acres outright, the purchase having been completed the previous spring, and the deed was kept in the cedar box on the mantelpiece with the marriage certificate and the children's birth records, the documents of a life that had been built on purpose. Hector Drummond had, over the 2 years since Letitia's visit to his store, gradually thawed into something approaching a decent neighbor. He had extended his first credit offer to Lewis in the spring of 1880, unsolicited, and Lewis had thanked him but had not needed it, which Drummond had taken with better grace than might have been expected. He had admitted to Silas Prout one evening, in a conversation that Prout had relayed to Lewis with some amusement, that he had been wrong about Townsend, and that sometimes a man's luck and a man's character were two entirely different things, and that he had confused them, and that the confusion had not reflected well on him. Prout had told Lewis this, and Lewis had said simply that he was glad Drummond had arrived at that conclusion, and hoped it served him well. Clyde Barrick's opinion had shifted more slowly and less completely, but by 1881 even Barrick had stopped telling the story of Lewis Townsend's cursed land at the saloon, if only because the land was so visibly and productively not cursed that the story had become an embarrassment rather than an entertainment. He did not go out of his way to speak to Lewis or Letitia, but he stopped going out of his way to speak against them, and in the economy of a small town, that was sufficient. Esteban and Marco Estrada continued to work the Townsend farm on a regular schedule through these years, and Lewis had come to regard Esteban in particular with the affection of a man who recognizes genuine skill and loyalty when it is given to him. On the occasion of the farm's third excellent harvest, Lewis had given Esteban a significant year-end payment that was more than agreed wages, and had said, without elaboration, that the farm had done well and Esteban had been part of that, and that he wanted it acknowledged. Esteban had nodded with the self-possessed dignity of a young man who had learned not to be surprised by either injustice or its occasional opposite, and had thanked Lewis in the direct way that Lewis understood and respected. Marta Hollies had become a permanent fixture in Letitia's life, the kind of friendship that develops between women who respect each other's complete independence while also providing the specific companionship that only another woman can offer. She came to the farm on Sunday afternoons regularly, sitting at the kitchen table with Letitia while the men tended to evening chores, and the children occupied themselves with the busy investigations of small people discovering the world. They talked about everything, practical and philosophical, the way intelligent women talk when they have been given sufficient time and a cup of strong coffee. Marta had a broad and wry view of human nature from her years running the boarding house, and Letitia had a direct and specific view of the natural world from her years of farming, and the conversation between these two perspectives was always interesting. In the spring of 1882, Letitia received a letter from Dr. Holbrook at the State College in Manhattan, asking whether she would be willing to submit a written account of her soil amendment methods for publication in the college's agricultural bulletin. He had heard, through the network of agricultural correspondents in the state, about the unusually high yields being achieved on the Townsend farm, and had made connections back to the letters she had sent him in 1878 and 1879 about the alkaline section and the bottomland chemistry. She sat with the letter for a long time, reading it twice, and then she showed it to Lewis that evening. He read it and looked up at her. "You should do it," he said, immediately and without qualification. "It would mean writing it all out formally," she said. "Everything I've been doing, the wood-ash ratios, the composting cycle, the drainage adjustments, it would take considerable time. The spring planting will take 6 weeks," he said. "After that, the crops don't need daily management until July. You have time between June and July. I can take on the direct field work through that period." She looked at him. "You would do that?" "I am already planning to do that," he said. "It would have been very difficult to write without having planned for it, so I planned for it." She stared at him for another moment and then covered her face with both hands in the gesture she made, when something moved her beyond what she was prepared to show openly, and he came around the table and put his arms around her from behind and pressed his face to the side of her head, and she brought her hands down and covered his where they rested across her shoulders. "Lewis Townsend," she said. Yes, he said. You are the best man I have ever known. You have very high standards, he said, so I take that seriously. She wrote the account over the summer of 1882, in the hours between afternoon chores and supper, filling 20 pages of her careful, precise handwriting with the accumulated knowledge of 4 years of intensive attention to a specific piece of land. She sent it to Dr. Holbrook in August and received, 6 weeks later, a letter saying it would be published in the January 1883 bulletin, and that it was, in his professional opinion, one of the most rigorous and practically useful accounts of soil management he had encountered from a non-institutional source. He asked at the end of the letter whether she had considered applying for the new agricultural extension teaching program the college was developing for rural counties. She put this letter also on the table in front of Lewis. He read it and looked up. Well, he said, it would mean occasional travel, she said, a few days at a time to the surrounding counties. I can manage the farm for a few days, he said. The boys are young, she said. Marta will help, he said. She has told you approximately 40 times that she would be glad to help with the boys when needed. She means it. Letitia looked at him. You are entirely too reasonable about this. I am reasonable about things that have clear answers, he said. The answer here is yes, you should do it, and we will manage the home front, and you will go and teach other farmers in other counties what you have figured out here, because it will help them the way it has helped us, and that is what a person with good knowledge does with it. She leaned across the table and kissed him, firmly and with intent. That is what a person with good knowledge does with it, she agreed. By the winter of 1882, the Townsend farm had become, in a quiet way that required no announcement, a place that other farmers came to look at and ask questions about. Not in large organized groups, just individually, a neighboring farmer stopping by to ask about the bottomland corn yield, a family from the North County asking about the cattle rotation. Lewis answered all such questions with the same openness that Letitia used in everything, because they had both understood from their own experience what it meant to have information that could help you and not have access to it. Their home was full and warm and real. Daniel was 3 years old, a serious child with his mother's dark eyes and his father's deliberate way of approaching anything new, testing it carefully before committing to it. James was 1, loud and certain and in constant motion, a creature of pure appetite for the world who had to be watched near the creek and the chicken yard with vigilance. The dog, a brown hound named Chester who had arrived as a puppy the previous spring in a cardboard box from a neighboring litter and had established himself as an authority on the property, maintained a tireless attention to both boys that took significant pressure off everyone else. Lewis had taken on the night watch habit of the farming family, the half-awake listening for wind changes or animal distress that kept him attuned to the farm even in sleep. Letitia had the same habit, and there were nights when they both lay still in the dark listening to the same sound, the creak of the barn in a northwest wind, the distant call of something in the lower field, and would turn to each other in the dark and exchange a few quiet words, and then lie back listening together. And the shared wakefulness was its own intimacy, the kind that belongs specifically to people who have built something together. On a January night in 1883, a night when the temperature had dropped to something serious, and the wind was steady from the north, and the snow lay a foot deep on the plains, Letitia and Lewis sat by the fire after the boys were in bed, she with her pen and the February correspondence, and he with a new agricultural pamphlet from the state that had arrived that week. And the fire crackled, and the house held the cold out with the particular sturdy confidence of a well-built structure that has been properly maintained, and the lamp made its warm circle on the table. Lewis set down his pamphlet and looked at her across the table. She looked up. I have been thinking, he said, about the spring of 1878, when you came across the fence line and told me that land doesn't turn against people. I remember, she said. I want you to know, he said, that I did not understand that morning what I was meeting. I thought you were a sensible woman with good land knowledge. I was right about that. But I did not understand yet that I was meeting the person my life had been in the process of becoming. She was quiet, looking at him across the warm lamplight. I think about how close I came to not being ready, he said, to letting the town's idea of me become my idea of myself, to believing that the land had turned against me because I had let myself believe I deserved it too. You never believed that, she said. I was very close to believing it, he said. In the winter of 1877, I was very close. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Outside the window, the January wind moved across the snow-covered fields, the fields that lay dormant and full of their own stored potential under the white, waiting for March, waiting for the turning, waiting for the particular morning when the ground would soften again and the work could begin. But you didn't, she said. You planted again. That is the whole of it. We planted again, he said. The third time we planted together, and it came up gold. She squeezed his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat there together in the warm circle of lamplight with the fire going, and the cold outside, and their two sons sleeping above them. This woman who had come off a stage with a trunk and a canvas sack of glass jars, and a decision that no one was going to make her life smaller than she could make it herself. And this man who had worked his cursed land through 2 failures and a brutal 3rd year, and had been too stubborn or too faithful or perhaps too fundamentally decent to stop. And the farm lay around them in the winter dark. 242 acres of worked and tended and understood earth that would come. Spring be planted again. It would come up gold. They both knew it. They knew it the way you know a thing that has been true for long enough that doubt has simply become unavailable, a luxury that has been traded in for something better, something that has the particular weight and warmth of a truth fully lived into. There were years ahead of them that they could not see yet, years that would bring more harvests and more challenges, and the particular geography of a long life built together in a hard and beautiful country. Daniel would grow into a tall, serious young man who read agricultural journals at the supper table, and could tell you the Latin name of any field grass in the county, and who would, at 15, win the state's junior agricultural competition with a soil analysis project that his mother helped him design, and his father helped him execute. James would grow into a different kind of person entirely, loud and social and drawn to the mechanical, who would become fascinated by the new farm machinery arriving in the county through the 1890s, and would spend his early adult years in Wichita working for an implement company, before coming home to the farm with both expertise and a wife named Clara, who made Letitia laugh more than anyone had in years. Esteban Estrada would eventually buy his own parcel 3 miles south of the Townsend farm, with the help of a reference letter signed by both Lewis and Letitia, and submitted to the land office without ceremony but with total commitment. And he would farm it for 40 years and his children after him. And when people in the county talked about the standard for good soil management, they talked about the Townsend method, which was in the agricultural bulletin and was taught in the extension program, and was really the Fletcher method, as Lewis always said without fail whenever someone called it anything else. There would be a third child, a daughter born in 1885, who Letitia named Ruth after no one in particular, but because she liked the name, a direct and solid name for a direct and solid person, which Ruth proved to be from the first week of her life. Lewis, holding this daughter for the first time in the same bedroom where he had held both his sons, said that he believed the farm was now complete, and Letitia had looked at him with raised eyebrows and said she would make no promises on behalf of the farm or anyone on it, and he had laughed the full real laugh and said that was entirely fair. And on a particular March morning in the spring of 1884, 6 years after Letitia Fletcher had stepped off a stage in Caldwell Creek with a trunk and a plan and a promise to herself, She stood at the edge of the plowed bottomland field in the early morning light, and pressed a seed of bloody butcher corn into the dark, rich earth, and felt it find its place there. The fit of it, the particular rightness of a thing being exactly where it needs to be. Lewis stood beside her, doing the same thing 30 yards down the row, moving with the ease of a man absolutely at home in his work, in his land, in his life. He looked up and saw her looking at him across the morning field, and he straightened up, and his face did what it always did when he looked at her, what it had been doing since a March morning 6 years ago, when she had told him across a fence line that land doesn't turn against people. The particular expression of a man who has found the thing he needed and understands the scale of what that finding meant. She put her hand flat on the dark earth for a moment, feeling the faint stored warmth of it, the beginning warmth that meant the season was turning. Then she straightened up and went back to work, and Lewis went back to work, and the seed went into the ground, and the Kansas sky arched enormous and blue overhead, and the creek ran full below the slope, and somewhere a meadowlark called from the fence post, the same post it had called from the first morning she came here, or one exactly like it, and the morning opened up around them with all the particular promise of a plain spring, which is to say with everything.